What's up, guys? I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Daytona 500. A lot of guys are, they have their opinions, and from the looks of it, it seems to have been I guess, a positive race for most people. Um, I I can't really say I agree. Uh, Believe it or not, I'm not trying to criticize. I'm not trying to look for bad stuff. Some people automatically, have this negative reaction to criticism, and right away they go crazy. They're like, "Oh, it's people like you that ruin everything. You're part of the what's you're everything that's wrong with the NASCAR community, and blah 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 and all this stuff." How do I personally see this? I read this in the comment sections and stuff. I posted a comment. I think it was in. I don't remember the guy's name. Kamikaze, I think his name is. And I said, hey, the first part of the race was okay for restrictor plate racing as far as that goes. It was better than most of the ones in recent years. I'll admit that it had its moments here and there, but to me, the second half of the race, or I would say the last quarter of the race, just was not enjoyable to me. The early part of the race, it was warmer out. David Land brought up some really good points in his video. He talked about how the weather plays a big role in these races because these cars are so aero dependent that you don't really know what kind of race you're going to get. It depends on the weather conditions. So we did see that play out throughout the race. Early on in the race, it was a little warmer. There was a little more humidity in the air. So the cars were a little bit harder to handle, and it did create a lot of areas of where the cars did kind of separate, and you had like mini packs, or you had like an outside line and the inside line was working, which we haven't really seen work in recent years. It's not really normal to see the inside line be the dominant line, and it was really dominant in this race. So it was something new, different, right? And I do think that when you see something change a little bit, there's this automatic feeling like, oh, things are different. There's something exciting going on, when in reality, it's a little change here and there. I'm not a fan of restrictor plate racing. Those of you who do watch my videos and you've heard me talk about these things before, I'm not a fan of pack racing. I don't like restrictor plate racing. I don't like Daytona, Talladega racing. I don't think those races have been really entertaining since like maybe the 90s. Completely different eras, and cars were different. You just didn't have this much engineering and aerodynamics dictating these races back then. So I'm not a fan of restrictor plate racing. So I'm being as fair as I can be, and I can honestly say the race was better than most of the restrictor plate races we've seen in I don't know how many years, right? But it wasn't that much more entertaining that it's like it's going to convert someone like myself or other people who don't really like pack racing. I don't think so. It's not going to convert someone. To me, if you're already a fan of restrictor plate racing, I could see why you're excited. If you're not a fan of restrictor plate racing, I thought, okay, it was a little surprising, especially after watching Speed Weeks and the Clash and the duels and all that stuff. I do think that's one area NASCAR should rethink, maybe restructure this whole beginning of each season. I think by the time you get to the Daytona 500, you're almost overwhelmed with restrictor plate racing, right? It's almost like 2 straight weeks of nothing but pack racing. By the time you get to watch the Daytona 500, honestly, I want it to be over with. I don't really look forward to the Daytona 500 like I used to many years ago. And I think they've oversaturated the whole Speed Weeks deal with all the other races as well. And even though this race was surprisingly better than everything we've seen in the past 2 weeks, including trucks and Xfinity and all that stuff, it wasn't as great as a lot of people are making it out to be. That's just my opinion, right? There's no right or wrong. I just didn't enjoy it as much. It seems to me like more people liked it than disliked it. So that's a good thing, right? It doesn't really matter how I feel about it. If it's generating excitement for other people, then I'm just one guy. I'm okay with that. I can accept that. What I don't like is being attacked in a comment section, or other people who say, hey, I don't like this. It's still pack racing. Yeah, it had its moments, but you're not going to tell me this is all of a sudden, hey, NASCAR nailed it. And there's a lot that went into this Daytona 500. One, like I said, David Land brought up a lot of good points, and one of those things was the weather, and that played a role in it. So if you're really going to go into all of these races and just praying for the right weather conditions so that you can have that type of excitement in parts of the race, that's not a recipe for success. I'm sorry to tell you. Also, they said that France actually told the drivers that they better start running the low line as well. So he kind of issued an order, right? And when you got to ask drivers to do something that they don't want to do just to make the race exciting, that's not good either. And I think that when you look at this race, you got to take everything into consideration. I don't like that. The fact that the drivers have to be told to race in a particular type of way because they want fans to that it's entertainment, it's show business. And this bothers me. One of the criticisms that casual fans have of NASCAR is a lot of people don't consider it a sport. And now you yourself, as NASCAR, as the governing body of NASCAR, the sport, you're going out there and you're saying, hey, we're show business. I don't know, man. I'm not comfortable with that. I'm a huge NASCAR fan, but I've always looked at NASCAR as a sport. And I wish other people, casual fans or people on the outside looking in who don't really know a lot about NASCAR, I want them to understand why NASCAR is a legitimate sport. And they seem to be shooting themselves in the foot, and they're just doing the opposite. And they're kind of, it feels fabricated. That's one of the things I hate about restrictor plate racing. So the more you take out of the driver's hands, the more control, then it just feels fabricated. You're running wide open. You can't do anything unless somebody gets in line with you or a hole opens up. I don't find that entertaining. I don't think that's real racing. That's just my opinion. Then there's the wrecks. And then I had a few people attack me in the comment section about, hey, it was exciting because you never knew when the big one was going to happen. And at any moment with these cars so close together, anything could have happened. And you're stupid. Somebody called me an idiot because I wasn't excited by that. I'm sorry. To me, that's a circus. It's a circus. I don't watch these races because I want to see a huge 20-car pileup. To me, that is juvenile. That kind of mentality. I'm not going to go as far to tell people, hey, you're not a real NASCAR fan. If you just come to watch wrecks. Who am I to say that? But I do find it juvenile. I think that if that's what equals entertainment to you, what is this? The WWE? I don't like it. And then it's a big contradiction that flies in the face of everything NASCAR talked about just a few years ago. I've talked about this before. It wasn't that long ago when Carl Edwards was still racing, and he was one of the guys who came out and said it, and NASCAR backed him, was that the cars need to be harder to drive. that they have too much downforce, that they need to lower the spoilers, that the harder the cars are to handle, that the better it is, because now the best drivers are going to rise to the top. They still, listen, honestly, they're still at the front, the best drivers, because they got the best equipment. There's a lot of other reasons for that. But I want to see these guys race, where they have to manhandle these cars. When you can run wide open around a 1.5 mile track and not have to lift, that's a fucking problem. That's a huge area of the race that you're taking out of the driver's hands. So you have all these huge wrecks, and that's another thing, like the point I was about to make. NASCAR wanted to make the sport a little less expensive for owners, and they talked about the expense of building these cars, and that having to fix wrecked race cars was not a good thing. This is the exact opposite of trying to alleviate that problem. So you had, I think, 90% of the entire field was involved in a wreck. At the end of the race, there were like 5 cars that were clean, that made it through that blender of a race. That's exciting. I'm sorry, I can't get on board with that. Now, if you disagree with me, that's fine. I don't have a problem. Disagree, give me your 2 cents, criticize something I say, but do it like an adult. Don't come out here and say, hey, you're an idiot, you're what's wrong with NASCAR, there's people like you always complaining. I'm just calling it like I see it. Nobody wants NASCAR to succeed more than I do. I love NASCAR. I'm still a hardcore fan. I still pay money to go to these races. I want to see the sport succeed. I want it to get back to the popularity it had years ago. And I want people that are not hardcore NASCAR fans to open their eyes and start looking at this as a legitimate sport and see all the intricacies that make NASCAR special. But they're not going to ever be open to that when you get a circus, which is what Daytona and these speed weeks, this whole thing's a fucking circus. And this is why I am worried about this aero package, because imagine getting this shit every week. That's going to be the final nail in NASCAR's coffin. Mark my fucking words. Now, I'm like I said, I'm not 100% sure what we're going to get till we see it. But so far, I don't like the shit I'm seeing. So, you got all these huge wrecks. It's a big fucking blender. Anybody can win. If you're lucky enough to avoid some wrecks and you're there at the end, you got a shot. Ryan Preece was in it at the end. I did enjoy some of the little aspects of the racing early on in the race. I'm not telling you it was the worst race ever. This was better than, I can't remember the last time there was a Daytona 500 that was as good as this one in the early part. But that's low-hanging fruit, man. That it's not like we're talking about, it's a low bar. Restrictor plate racing has been that bad, so that what we got yesterday, in comparison, yeah, it is an improvement. But overall, at the end of the day, we sat through 4.5 hours of a race that legitimately should have been 3 hours, 3.5 hours max. The last hour to hour and a half of that race, it was agonizing, with all these crazy wrecks and just a red flag, and half of that time was just watching commercials and waiting for the cleanup and for the cars to go racing again. Could you imagine what it's like for people at the fucking track? So that's another thing. Then you had this is another thing that David Land brought up that I was thinking as I was watching the race, and I'm glad he brought it up, because it was like I thought I was the only one that saw this. But the broadcast, right? And I know a lot of people hate Waltrip. I like him. I just like his personality. But there's a lot of things about him that they just make me cringe. You know, when Junior was racing, he was a huge, you know, I get it, man. They like Junior, they were rooting for him, but these guys, they don't know how to hide their bias. As a commentator, you got to be a little more of a broadcaster and not a cheerleader. And David Land even brought up this point when they kept pumping up how great the race was. And that only reminded me of that it wasn't as great as they were trying to make it seem. I said, yeah, you know what? It's better than what we've been getting lately. But the reason for it was they just happened to have the right weather conditions, and they had their marching orders from Brian France, and he told them, you guys better start running that bottom line. We want to put on a good show. So you combine all those things, really, it wasn't like it was a natural race that occurred just, organically. There was some meddling going on. So they kept telling you how great the race was, and Jeff Gordon and Waltrip. And then at one point they were showing the stands. And there were a lot of people there. I will say that. I'm not going to say that it was a half-empty track. A lot of people showed up. So it's a step in the right direction, but they were making it sound like there wasn't any empty seats. At one point, I forgot his name. This happens to me. Sometimes I get a brain freeze. But it wasn't Waltrip or Jeff Gordon. It was the other guy. He said, oh, there's no empty seats in the house. And they were scanning the stands. And meanwhile, I saw plenty of empty seats. Now, I'm not saying that the place was half empty. I'm not saying that. But there were empty seats, and it was very clear and visible on TV. And that shit fucking bothers me. When I'm watching something with my own eyes, and you're telling me that what I'm looking at is not that it's something else. That's insulting. And to me, if you're a viewer and you're watching that broadcast and you're being told how great everything is and how there's no empty seats anywhere, I don't see any empty seats. Meanwhile, as they're telling you that, you see plenty of empty seats. They're spread out. It wasn't like there's a whole grandstand that's empty. There were a lot of people. But don't tell me that the place was jam-packed or standing room only and no empty seats. And I'm looking at it as you're saying that, and there's plenty of empty seats. That shit is insulting, man. That shit fucking bothers me. So, when you add up all these things, at the bottom line is the race was better than most of the restrictor plate races that we've seen in several years. Okay? But it wasn't fantastic. Like, it wasn't like, it was just in comparison. Yeah, it was better. And it had its moments. And to me, the most exciting thing throughout the day was watching Matt DiBenedetto competing up front for long periods of time. He led the most laps and fight. He never really lost the top 10. Like, he was always up there mixing it up. That was exciting. I do like to root for underdogs, okay? I've said it before. I do have a tendency to root for underdogs. So I do end up experiencing a lot of disappointment because that's in my nature. I just don't like rooting for these front runners. So that was, to me, the biggest story of the day, okay? But in the end, it came down to one of these powerhouse teams, and you had top three guys, all Gibbs cars. So I can't get excited about that. I'm sorry. As much as I hate all of those drivers, and as much as I really hate Hamlin, I will concede that I think it was a nice touch that he did get to win the race because of J.D. Gibbs and his passing and the connection to the car. That was a very touching connection. I appreciate stuff like that. I'm not blind to it. And even though I don't like Denny Hamlin and I'm not a fan of these super teams, I will say that I didn't have a problem with him winning. I could stomach it, and I would have preferred one of these underdogs like a Matt DiBenedetto or even this Ryan Preece who was in the mix at the end. Just that would have been a cool curveball just to end it that way. It wouldn't have made the race that much better for me, but it would have been nice. But I'm not gonna complain about Hamlin winning. It was a good story. I did feel for the whole Gibbs organization and that connection. I did feel for that. I'm not a fucking ogre just because I don't like the super teams or Hamlin or Kyle Busch or anything. I took the moment for what it was. I appreciated it. And I'm not going to shit all over that. So, overall, the race was better. And honestly, if the race ended the way it started, with that type of racing and that, type of excitement and having someone like DiBenedetto in the mix at the end, I think I would have liked the race just a little more. So overall, it is what it is. I'm not a fan of restrictor plate racing. This race did not convert me, and I don't think anything will. I do think that these speed weeks, they really need to retool this stuff, tweak it. And you know what? Do we really need these dual races? Do we really need the clash? I know a lot of people are going to get mad that I said that. But by the time you get through all that, and then you got the trucks, and then you got the Xfinity, you sat through all of this speed weeks, restrictor plate racing. By the time the Daytona 500 comes around, me personally, I'm petered out. I'm tired. I'm like, now I got to sit through what I know is going to be a 4.5 hour long race, wreckfest, pack racing. So for me, personally, I don't look forward to it. I look forward to the end of it and then moving on to the real racing, which is what I've always considered, going to Atlanta and then moving on from there. So moving away from this race, going to Atlanta, it's different now because of this aero package, and I got my fingers crossed that I'm wrong. I want to be wrong. I really do. I want it to be that I saw the race and it was, wow, it was exciting. These guys were really fighting. Driving was hard for these guys, and really you could see a lot of the skill involved, and the drivers had their own destiny in their hands. I'm hoping for that. I really am. But I don't think I'm not optimistic, but I'm hoping. So I do look forward to watching the race. What do you guys think? I know a lot of you are going to disagree with me. You're probably going to not like what I said. Please keep in mind, it's just my opinion. It's just how I feel about restrictor plate racing. I've listed all the reasons why I don't like it, why I'm probably never going to like it. This aero dependency, NASCAR, I think, is headed in the wrong direction. I think the key is to get away from downforce and aero. And the best and easiest and quickest way to do that is, like I've said before, you got to raise these cars a couple of inches off the ground. Get that dirty air underneath the car, which will make the cars a lot harder to handle and on edge. And that's where the drivers come in. You're not going to be able to drive wide open at these other tracks. And that's all it takes. 2 or 3 inches. Get some of that air under the car. Take away downforce. Lower that spoiler back to what it was last year. And then add 100 horsepower. Alright? You still want to use a restrictor plate, that's fine. But open it up. Give these guys an additional 100 horsepower, shorter spoiler, raise the car off the ground just a couple of inches. And that's all you got to do. It's not rocket science. You don't have to redesign all this shit. Keep the aero ducts and see what happens. Just see it. Try it. If after a week or two of racing and you start seeing that this is nothing but pack racing, if NASCAR doesn't have a plan B in effect, ready to go, they're in deep trouble. And I think that one last thing about speed weeks, that it's shown that almost 90% of everything we saw for the last 2 weeks has been this really tight-knit pack racing. I think if you don't know by now that that doesn't create excitement, if you don't get that by now, then you never will. This idea that let's bunch up these cars, create a package that they can't get away from each other, and now you're creating this phony sense of excitement is the wrong way to go. The wrong way to go. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope it turns out that the racing is a lot better than I thought it was. I am hoping I'm wrong. So, that's it. Those are my thoughts. Are you pissed off about my opinions? Is it bad enough that you just wish I'd stop making videos? Let me know. Because to be honest with you guys, sometimes I do get to the point where I'm like, why am I doing this? Maybe I am alone in these thoughts. And if that's the case, then it really doesn't matter what I think. If most people actually like this stuff, then don't listen to me. I'm not trying to convert people. I'm just giving you my opinion, how I feel about it. I'm not a threat to NASCAR, or I'm not a threat to your enjoyment. You could still like these races. You don't have to agree with me. Those are my thoughts. What are your comments? I look forward to seeing what they are. Later.